History isn't just a list of dates.
Events are linked with one another and indirectly affect past and future.
Our understanding is not set in stone, it's constantly evolving.
We're following history's timelines to find the truth behind what we've always been told. I'm Anne Grace Evans.
And I'm Anna Catherine Creech, and this is Timelines.
Today we're starting with part 1 of the Tudor dynasty, Henry Tudor, or Henry VII. Henry VII becomes king after Richard III dies at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He is the last king to die in battle, and Henry VII is the last king to gain the throne through conquest. So it sort of marks the end of the medieval period and the beginning of a modern era where force is no longer really the main basis of power.
I think it's really tough to put in perspective the lives of these people because it was so different than modern times.
And they were just coming off this 100-years-long conflict known as the War of the Roses. Now, the interesting thing about Henry Tudor being the victor is that he was definitely the underdog going in. Not only did he have less troops than Richard, his claim to be king could be considered dubious. So let's back up. It's 1377. King Edward III has just died. This is really the beginning of when the unrest starts, when the royal family starts splitting into two separate houses. The House of Lancaster, from Edward III's third son, the Duke of Lancaster, and the House of York from his fourth son, the Duke of York. Henry Tudor is a direct descendant of Lancaster, but there's a problem. There are two branches of the House of Lancaster. The first is started by Lancaster's firstborn legitimate son, Henry, who will later become Henry IV. Another line starts with Lancaster's illegitimate son, John Beaufort. He will eventually be declared legitimate by an act of parliament and a papal dispensation, but when his half-brother Henry becomes Henry IV, he will recognize that legitimacy, but he will add a codicil. It will say that none of John Beaufort's descendants can ever become king.
Like, it's a side note. Like, hey, by the way, I recognize you, but you can never be king.
Yeah, he adds it in a different font. It's the same act of parliament, just somebody made a little caret and added that part.
A caveat.
Okay, back to 1485. Henry Tudor gets his claim through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. It is dicey because the codicil is there, but she believes that the codicil doesn't really count. It doesn't hold the same weight as an act of parliament or a papal dispensation, so she believes that her son can still be king. She sends him into exile to prepare to take on Richard III. You wouldn't really bet on Henry Tudor. All he really has going for him is his mother's crazy belief that one day he'll be king. Until they get a lucky break.
What is the break that they get?
So Elizabeth Woodville is the widowed queen of Edward IV, the first Yorkist king and older brother of Richard III.
Elizabeth Woodville is such a fascinating character. We can't go into it right now, but it's just layers and layers of intrigue. So we'll circle back around to that in the future.
Elizabeth Woodville and Lady Margaret Beaufort are on opposing sides, but they're both agreed. They hate Richard III, and they will do what they have to bring him down. That means rallying around the only viable alternative, which is Henry Tudor in exile. To add weight to his claim, Elizabeth Woodville promises her own daughter, Elizabeth of York, in marriage. It would combine the two warring royal houses and, theoretically at least, bring about peace.
The two parts that had been fighting for so long are now uniting because the matriarchs of both sides are making it happen.
So with the joining of these two houses, they've merged into one dynasty. All their children going forward are going to be the reconciliation of this century-long war. That's what the Tudor Rose represents. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster being bred together. So a little bit of an aside on badges. they're going to keep coming up. It may seem a bit weird to us that every single person, every single family has their own imagery that goes on everything, but like think of it almost like wedding china, where you get to pick your pattern, except it would be on literally everything. Columns, crown molding, clothes. Your badge says something about you specifically, but it's also tied into your larger family, like what role you play within it, what role your spouse played.
Is it the same as a coat of arms or not?
A badge represents a single person. A coat of arms represents a family, and usually the two tie together.
That is redundant. My word. Okay, let's see. I see what you're saying now.
They really love symbolism in this period. Actually, if you go to the Houses of Parliament in London, you will not only see the Tudor rose, but you will also see Lady Margaret Beaufort's badge, which is the portcullis, which is like those gates with the pointy ends that come down at the end of moat. That actually brings up a good point. Everything in this world is deeply symbolic. Henry and Elizabeth actually named their first son Arthur because he was meant to represent the coming together of England. It also represents Henry Tudor's Welsh origins through his father, Owen Tudor. So Henry Tudor tried to claim both King Arthur and another legendary Welsh king, Cadwallader, in his ancestry by flying the Red Dragon of Wales as he rode through the Welsh countryside to gather an army against Richard. He wanted everyone to know that the coming of the Tudor dynasty had been foreshadowed.
What are you referring to?
The promise with these legendary kings is that they will come again to usher in a new golden age for England. So not everyone feels that way, that they're heading to some golden age for England, and there's pretty much right away plots from several of the noble families. So just another side note on families. Throughout English history, there are several family names that will reoccur, like Mortimer, Howard, Percy, Stafford, Neville, Grey, and it gets confusing because it'll seem like it's the same person through the centuries, but it's really just one family using the same name over and over again. So the Staffords, who initially joined Elizabeth Woodville's plot to overthrow Richard III, now join Lord Francis Lovell, who was a good friend of Richard III, in a plot against Henry VII. For this, we go to the Chronicles. Quick explainer on Chronicles. In the Middle Ages, this is what passes for record keeping. Usually written by a monk or other, hopefully, contemporary author who either is working off official correspondence or, more likely, interviews and oral history.
Like newspapers before newspapers, kind of.
Sort of. If, on occasion, the newspaper account is writing 50 years after the event that happened.
Okay. That's definitely worth pointing out.
So they don't generally give their sources, so it isn't usually entirely clear where they got their information.
Okay.
They also aren't completely neutral because they're either employed by the church or a specific court. So maybe take it all with a grain of salt, because it's often the only written record that we have of the time. But for this first uprising, fortunately, we do have some supporting material. So while the king is touring the north, he is about to be ambushed by Francis Lovell and the Staffords. He gets word of it ahead of time and is able to put it down. And there's record in the patent rolls, which are like legal filings of the time, of Francis Lovell losing all of his lands because of his participation in this uprising. But he's not completely finished. He manages to escape and flee to the court of a woman who is no friend of Henry Tudor, Margaret of Burgundy.
Burgundy is a region in France, right?
Well, at the time, Burgundy is its own separate country. So Margaret of Burgundy is the sister of Edward IV and Richard III. According to the Chronicle of Polydore Virgil, who is the main source for this time.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can we break that name down?
Polydor Virgil.
Polydor. Polydor is his first name.
He is from Urbino, and he shows up at the court of Henry VII in the early 1500s to write a chronicle for him. So he's not completely unbiased. He definitely is pro Henry, though for the most part, he writes an account that does seem pretty reliable.
So right before Henry's death, someone's brought in to document his life.
Yes. Yes.
And that is
Polydor Virgil.
Polydor Virgil.
He's allowed to go through letters and patent rolls and accounts for Parliament and things like that. So according to Polydor Virgil, in his chronicle, his description of Margaret has her basically being like a harpy and relentlessly going after Henry. She pursued Henry with insatiable hatred and with fiery wrath, never desisted from employing every scheme which might harm him as a representative of the hostile faction.
This woman seems deeply vengeful.
Though Polydor Virgil might be a little bit chauvinistic in the lens with which he sees her, he writes, "So ungovernable is a woman's nature. Actuated by her wrath, the woman continually sought to evolve a device by which she could engineer his destruction. And with Lovell showing up at her court, she now has an ally, and very soon she's going to have an instrument to try to destroy Henry." So, again, according to Virgil's chronicle, there all of a sudden shows up on the scene a boy claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick.
This is such an interesting story. I love this part.
Polydor Virgil talks about a priest who gets together this scheme to raise this boy. It's not entirely clear. Some later chronicles will jumble up this story. If he first claims to be a son of Edward IV, but eventually it would seem that the identity that he lands on is Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence, who is the brother of both Edward IV and Richard III. So he would be the last surviving York, the legitimate heir to the throne.
Is he just walking up to a palace somewhere saying, "Hey, it's me"?
So, claiming to be the Earl of Warwick, he crops up in Ireland, where either because they actually believe he is the Earl of Warwick, or just because they hate Henry, they crown him king, Edward VI.
That is so bizarre. Who is endorsing this? Who's saying, yeah, I recognize him?
Margaret is lending her weight to this, and also all the Irish nobility. There's actually letters from Henry VII to the Pope saying that all the Irish priests and bishops who went along with this, who threw their weight behind this pretender, should be excommunicated from the church. They should be stripped of all their titles. They too managed to put down this rebellion.
Edward the Pretender.
Edward the Pretender. His real name is Lambert Simnel, and he was just a no one. The story of Lambert Simnel, as you said, is very interesting because there are people who have come to dispute it.
Dispute that he's a fraud?
Yes. Sort of. So, because Polydor Virgil is maybe not the most neutral of sources, I went looking for a different side of the story. Someone who was more pro-Yorkist. So I went to the Richard III Society, and one of the articles that I found regarding this chapter in his points out that maybe too much weight has been put on the Polydor Virgil chronicle. Polydor Virgil is a near contemporary of the action, but not the closest. So this rebellion happens in 1486, and Actually, we do have a chronicle from 1490, so almost right when it happened. So this is a chronicle from Jean Molyneux, in which not only does it not mention the name Lambert Simnel, it also claims that the boy who was crowned King Edward VI in Dublin was actually the Earl of Warwick, which would completely go against everything Polydore Virgil said. As I said earlier, Polydore Virgil would seem to be, for the most part, pretty reliable. I think he's reliable. But this article does make a good point, and it's important to do due diligence and just check everything.
Yeah, now I'm questioning everything. I feel like I do need to go back.
So this Molyneux Chronicle specifically says that it's Edward. Polydore Virgil has said that that's impossible. He was in London in the Tower. So when Henry ascended the throne, he imprisoned Edward, Earl of Warwick, because he was the last living York boy. In the spirit of due diligence, I tried to go to the prison records and just make sure.
Yeah, what's in there?
That Edward is in the Tower. Before 1500, they don't have those records digitized. TBD on getting that record. There's another thing about the Jean Molyneux Chronicle, which is claiming that the boy crowned in Dublin is Edward, Earl of Warwick. He's writing from the court of Burgundy. So the court of Margaret, where for obvious reasons, they're really trying to promote the idea that this boy is who he says he is. It casts doubt on the reliability of what he's saying.
Did anyone ever go to the Tower of London to see if Edward was actually there?
So he was taken out and he was paraded around. Again, according to Polydore Virgil.
All right, so it's really just a story.
There was a boy because Henry writes to the Pope about him. So there definitely was a boy claiming to be Edward. Now, who he actually was, we can't say. So another reason why you wouldn't really trust Molyneux is because he doesn't seem to have a firm grasp on all the details of English history. For example, he talks about when the royal family, Edward IV's family, came to visit Margaret in Burgundy. He describes the sons as Edward and George, which is wrong and will become relevant very soon. Okay,
so he doesn't actually know exactly what he's talking about?
Yeah, it would appear that he does not really know what he's talking about. Margaret, not to be discouraged, quickly formulates another plot. This one is even more audacious. She really ups the ante. She takes in a boy who she claims is her nephew, Richard of Shrewsbury, aka one of the princes in the Tower. Richard, Duke of York. You know, not George. Like Molyneux said, the court chronicler who's supposed to be on it and know all these things believed this kid was named George.
Okay. Talk to me about Margaret of Burgundy and where she found this boy.
This boy, we really don't know. He showed up one day. He had some story about how he had been surviving since being released from the Tower. His jailer had mercy on him for his young age, and for some reason it took him years to show up at his aunt's court. It's all a little bit blurry.
Did people take his word at the time? Did people feel like this was real, or was it an obvious sham?
Margaret, whether she really believed this was her nephew or she just really wanted to get at Henry, it's unclear, but she 100% backs him, gives him what he needs.
So people are like, if Margaret believes that it's really her nephew, that's who it is.
A bit. The Yorkists in the court, people who are already predisposed to rebel against Henry, it is unclear whether they actually believe this kid is who he says he is.
Or they were just maybe just going along with it because it's kind of what they wanted anyways.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
So the kid is still in Burgundy. So they can't go get him. He's out there. He's causing trouble.
What's Henry's relationship with Burgundy at this time?
He slaps the trade embargo on them.
What familiar language?
Yeah, because they are harboring this pretender, as he says, or as they would claim, the true heir to the throne, the true King of England. He starts seeing exactly how loyal his courtiers are. Some start going over to Burgundy and pledging their allegiance. Now, some of these people are spies that he specifically sent there to report back to him what they thought.
What year are we talking about? Just to bring it back around.
So this is about 1494. Reviews are mixed. Some believe that this is the Duke of York that we all thought was murdered in the Tower. This is the true King of England. And some are like, I don't think so. Henry himself sent an official delegation. So these people were like there to specifically do the king's business. So keep that in mind. But they were like, not at all. This kid is an imposter. And in the Chronicle, Polydore Virgil makes a good point that if this kid is claiming that his older brother was in fact murdered in the Tower, why would King Richard III kill one and leave one alive? The attitude of if one kid was killed in the Tower, they probably both were. Makes a lot of logical sense. Even some of the royal houses of like France and Scotland are trying to get in on it and are kind of casually to tick off Henry, recognizing that, oh, hey, this is the Prince in the Tower. It would appear through the record that actually it's mainly this kid, this so-called Richard, writing to them to get them to acknowledge him. It's not like they haven't gone out of their way to acknowledge and give support to this guy. He just kind of showed up on their doorstep and they're like, this will make Henry really mad. Pretty much right away, as soon as Henry gets kind of frustrated and frazzled and goes to them and said, okay, well, we're not like trading partners anymore if you acknowledge this guy. They back down. The way that it all comes about of they acknowledge the kid in Burgundy, and then pretty soon after, they sign a new trade deal with Henry saying, okay, I'll drop the kid in Burgundy, shows that the whole thing was kind of a negotiating ploy.
So carrying on a fraud like this would be almost easy.
Yeah, it would. And that's why they tried.
It's just mind-boggling. So things you could have gotten away with, or the things they did get away with.
James IV of Scotland goes a bit farther than the rest, and he marries one of his cousins to this kid. Now, she's minor nobility. She is the king's cousin, but she's not that high up on the food chain. If they actually thought this guy was the rightful king of England, he would have made a better marriage than that.
Has old is he at this time?
He's like 24.
So he's not really a boy. He's a man.
Yeah, young man.
Okay, yeah.
So James has that bond of kinship now and says, okay, I will actually support you with an army. So just like Henry did 10 years earlier at the Battle of Bosworth, the exile is going to come and try to claim what he claims is his rightful throne.
It's wrapped up into a nice, chaotic little package. Yeah, okay.
Based on letters that Henry at the time sent to different administrators throughout the realm and towns where this guy is landing, his response would seem to be underwhelming. The Chronicle does say that he lands and people aren't like flocking to his side. But again, you can't just trust that the Chronicle is accurate in all things.
Right.
So going back to the letters of King Henry and his court, it would seem that their response was, yeah, people just weren't having it when he showed up. The interesting thing is that Lambert Simnel always seemed to have more support, even though this so-called Richard
put more effort into his persona, into trying to build these alliances in Europe.
So then what happened?
So they were beaten pretty easily.
Wow. And so what happens to him?
Well, at first, they take him to the tower where he writes his story. He tells everybody exactly who he is. So they have him under the direction of Henry, write his confession of who he actually is. And his name, he says, is Perkin Warbeck. And he is from Tournai in Flanders. He gives a bunch of details about his family and how he grew up and how he came to be involved in this scheme and became a pretender. So the thing about this is how this confession was come to in the tower, we don't exactly know. Possibly under duress. So is it 100% believable?
Absolutely not.
So yeah, that's what historians think. They think it's a grain of salt confession of not necessarily the whole thing should be believed. Some of it might have been strongly suggested to him, but they have gone back to Tournai and they have found that a lot of the names and the dates and the places which he mentioned do not.
Really?
Yes. So later interpretations of Henry VII are that he is this kind of miserly, spendthrift, very paranoid guy. And obviously, you've seen his reign up to this point. He has every right to be paranoid. And he was very frugal compared to other monarchs. He didn't spend a lot for himself personally, but there are other sides to him. On the paranoid frugal front, he did take steps to try to consolidate power and money and himself.
I've got a lot of respect for paranoid frugality. I can relate to that really well.
So he first off establishes these laws against livery and maintenance.
Yeah, these are cool. This is where I really started to understand how the nobility was able to control the population so intensely.
It is pretty wild. It was lawlessness during the Wars of the Roses years of people just gathering their own armies under their own banners, and pretty much it was like gangs, honestly, of this is my territory and these are my men, what are you gonna do about it? Type of.
And this is where I remember earlier you were talking about the badges and such. So like totally gang colors, right?
Exactly. So the law states that you can't have over a certain number of retainers wearing your badge. Because that will constitute an army.
Retainers being soldiers,
yes,
footmen,
people you pay, essentially.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, it's not the easiest to follow through on enforcing this law. There is correspondence from the time of towns who are like, you really need to enforce this law about the livery stuff because this person's private army is terrorizing it. So mixed results on the enforcement of the livery and maintenance ordinances.
I mean, how big was the territory that he was trying to enforce this within?
England?
Yeah, that's kind of hard to do, I would think.
Yeah, it is. Though he did establish more local law, justices of the peace, and more uniform ways of meting out law and order and punishment. Local justice trying to take certain nobles down to size in their territories.
Keeping the gangs under control
is a big part of his legacy, trying to ensure that no war of competing houses can ever happen again. Another way he did that is through his bonds and recognizances program. So basically, it's kind of like you swear as a noble that you're not going to get up to any trouble.
You're pledging allegiance.
Yeah. And if we do find out you failed to meet the requirements of the recognizance, not even like treason, then you forfeit this amount of money.
What do you mean this amount of money? Was it like a fine?
Yeah, essentially. That's why it's called a bond, because you pledge this amount of money for good behavior. So even Polydore Virgil, who is writing for Henry, loves Henry, says that in his desire to have people loyal to him through this system, it could go too far. It could be abuse. He says, to ensure they remained more thoroughly and entirely in obedience to him, it is not indeed clear whether at the start it was greed, but afterwards greed did become apparent. He also was hardened by the fact that it turned out that people he had complete trust in were against him. So one of these was Sir William Stanley, who was the brother of his stepfather. Sir William Stanley actually, by turning to his side at the Battle of Bosworth, may have won the day for him. He was the guy who put the crown on his head on the battlefield, actually.
And then he betrayed him?
Then he, it would seem, betrayed him. What exactly he did, how far he got, it's uncertain, but he had said in relation to Perkin Warbeck, if I knew that the boy in Burgundy was indeed Richard of Shrewsbury, and 100% I would follow him. Now, that's a conditional, but it's also not reassuring. They also searched his apartments and they found a chain of office with white roses on it. That would mean his Yorkist allegiance. Henry doesn't want to believe it at first. He really doesn't. Until they found that chain of office.
Okay, chain of office. Tell me about this, because it just sounds like a piece of jewelry that, yeah, could really easily just be placed in someone's home to make them look bad, right?
Well, the thing is, he doesn't super strongly deny it.
Dang.
And also, William is like the Lord Chamberlain, which is like one of the highest posts in government. So he's like in there, highly trusted, has direct access to Henry. So this is a really close to home betrayal. There's another thing, which this goes into how much do we trust the chronicles and how much could they potentially get wrong. So Polydore Virgil, who again has access to pretty much everything in the court, says of Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville that when Elizabeth Woodville goes to a nunnery, it is because she's banished there for some sort of plotting on perhaps the behalf of Lambert Simnel, and she essentially tried to betray her son-in-law.
And she dies in exile?
Well, that's what this chronicle says. And again, I want to state that I think, to the best of his ability, Polydore Virgil is trying to be accurate. I just think he's wrong here. And a lot of historians think he's wrong as well. That somewhere along the line he got it garbled or confused. Because the record would show that the king and the queen continued to visit her at the convent. They sent her gifts. More likely, she just decided to retire there because that's what widows did back in the day. It's not uncommon for wealthy older widows to just go into the convent as, you know, a retirement home. The records would indicate that she did live in some comfort and like as a queen while she was at this convent. And there's also some record that she had already been planning this move, again, into like essentially a retirement community. So there was probably no big betrayal, no plot, at least according to the physical record of the time. If there was one plot, it would maybe be that she didn't entirely go willingly. It was maybe Lady Margaret.
She was like, old lady, get out of my castle.
Yeah, that this court isn't big enough for two mother-in-laws type of thing. If she was pushed out, that might have been it. But based on the evidence, it's highly unlikely that she committed treason, I think.
Are there any surviving writings of Elizabeth Woodville?
Don't know.
That would be a wonderful thing for us to look into.
Yeah, Henry Tudor is given this harsh reputation for being greedy, and even his champion, his chronicler, admits that some greed might have been involved but he's also capable of great mercy, it would seem. So the first instance of this is back in 6, when all the rebellions are coming at him all at once. And he pretty much pardons everyone. And this is according to the Chronicle and also according to the patent rolls of the time of just aside from the ringleaders, he pretty much just lets everybody go. And this would
Why is that? He didn't want to create enemies? What do you think?
seems to be a tactic that he uses over and over again of he'll have somebody write out to the rebels and be like, well, if you stop now, all is forgiven. Like, it would just be so much easier not to do this and go home and swear allegiance to the king, and nothing bad will happen to you. And it's like a more of a carrot than a stick approach, and it seems to have worked, and he just kept using it. Also, what happens to Lambert Simnel is another example, according to Polydore Virgil, of his great mercy. So Lambert Simnel, according to Polydore Virgil's chronicle, ends up in the kitchens. When he's captured, Henry recognizes, oh, this is just a kid. He's just a pawn in this game. I'm just going to give him a job in the kitchens. And he works his way up to becoming a falconer.
That's so kind. Do you feel that that's really who he was, or do you feel like that's just how he was documented?
Well, so here's an interesting point we've come to. So most historians take the Polydore Virgil story to be accurate, and they cite Lambert Simnel as the kitchen boy. So most historians quote the spit-turn falconer story, but a thing does bother me about that. So going back into, or trying to at least, going back into their notes and bibliography to see where they're quoting that story from, they all seem to be quoting from Polydore Virgil. So they've fallen into the trap that the Richard III Society article claimed they did of they're taking Polydore Virgil at his word. So I would love to actually see if there is a record of Lambert Simnel working in the kitchens, being paid, or working as a falconer.
We have access to this record?
Again, they're not online. They're not digitized. So maybe TBD?
Yeah.
I would love to find that out for sure. Again, I don't think Polydore Virgil is like making it up, but he might be mistaken. Who knows?
Is the 10-year-old working in the kitchen and he has no mother?
According to Polydore Virgil, he's just nobody who was raised by a priest to pretend to be a royal. It would be fascinating to try to find him. Like, did he have parents? How did this priest get him? It is impossible to say with 100% accuracy, just from the documents that I have here, who these boys actually were. So Perkin, after giving his confession, appears to, lived freely in the royal household, pretty much. Not as like a guest or something. It was like more likely a servant.
How could they not just kill him? Wouldn't that be kind of like a standard practice for the day? Wasn't execution just popping off?
Yeah, it's kind of wild that he doesn't immediately go to execute him.
Maybe killing him would be too strong of an action.
Yeah, he just wants to show him as a nobody. But after he makes some trouble, he is writing to Margaret in Burgundy. He gets thrown in the tower with the Earl of Warwick. The real one. The most concerning thing that I found while preparing all of this is how much it does seem like historians have just kind of taken the Chronicle's word for it, which is a point. And I've said this over and over. I think the Chronicle is as accurate as it can be. He is trying, but I think just word of mouth and the telephone of it, what's to say that he didn't just get something wrong? It's food for thought. So they try to reform the tax code. I'll read you some of the chronicle of how Polydore explains these changes. Lest the poorer sort should be burdened with the charge of paying the troops for the war, levied money from the rich only, each contributing to the pay of the troops according to his needs. A benevolence. It could be perceived precisely how much each person cherished the king.
So that amount was left up to the individual household?
Yeah,
Or-
exactly.
Okay, wow. And that's how they gained favor in the court.
Yeah. However,
Okay.
since no one would have said he was less dutiful, all competed to pay the required money. So, kind of smart. And they came up with this kind of method of getting people to pay called a Morton's fork. A Morton's fork is basically if you have not been spending a lot, you must have saved up a lot and therefore be able to pay. So you can't claim poverty. But also, if you are spending a lot, well, then you have the money and you must be able to pay.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, exactly. In games like chess, they still refer to a Morton's fork as a situation of there's really no way out of this. So Henry's wealth is so vast because of these tax policies, because of these bonds, but also because he doesn't really like war. He's not interested in the glory or the fanfare of it. And aside from intervening in the conflict between Brittany and France and trying to put down all those rebellions, he doesn't really have any interest in it. He's way more interested in promoting trade. So, first of all, he will try to boost an industry that up till this point, not much thought has gone into promoting the wool industry. So the alum trade is something that the papacy is very protective over.
Can you tell me what alum is? Is that a mineral? What is that?
Yes, it's involved in the curing of wool products. And so the Pope has a monopoly on it, basically. And Henry has, without regard to the Pope's feelings, been sort of promoting the workaround trade of alum, black market style. And instead of going through the official Christian avenues, he's been promoting the import of alum from other places. And the Pope is not happy in his letters. It is remarkable that wool trade is coming to a monarch's attention. Like, that's something that wouldn't really have happened before. Another indication that the world is changing. It is no longer so medieval. Instead of talking about war and conquest and glory, though there'll still be more of that, obviously.
They're talking about trade and finance.
Yeah, the trade and finance is where their mind is. So there's also another pretty remarkable document from this time called the Inter Cursus Magnus, which Henry makes with the court of Burgundy. And in it, they talk about if any of the parties that are signatory to this treaty should become signatory to another treaty with another person, that party can be submitted to this original treaty for consideration and acceptance into this trade alliance. It's basically like an early Renaissance EU.
It's very impressive. It's very enlightened.
Yes, it's incredibly liberal for the time. So it just goes to show where his priorities lie. Also, it shows another thing, because one condition of the treaty is that it names Margaret and her meddling as things that have got to stop. This is interesting because this is the first really real contemporary indication we get that Margaret is middling, as Polydore Virgil says. We have Molinet, who is her contemporary, but obviously he's writing at her court and he's talking about what a kind and loving aunt she is. So, and then obviously Polydore Virgil is proclaiming that she's some harpy. So we never really got to see a real image of Margaret, and here she is in this treaty. Clearly, she's important enough that she is mentioned.
It just blows my mind, like, that a woman would have this much power to really create PR storm, tearing down people's perception of the royal family and its legitimacy.
I guess whatever you think rightly or wrongly about Margaret's meddling or her actions, she is pretty incredible. So England and what it's like at this time, because of all these treaties and the laws and ordinances to keep the peace and keep people from raising armies, the result is kind of going from a more confused time to something more idyllic, what we think of as Tudor England. So the growth of the cloth trade, which you get from the inner cursus magnus and cheaper alum, meant that many farmers went from just subsistence farming to mainly sheep farming, and that meant more wool. The growth of the wool trade led to the growth of local markets, local market towns. So in the patent rolls, you can see when it's granted to make a market, to make a little trade fair where everybody can bring their goods and they can barter and things like that.
And then a town pops up around that.
Yes, and you would see increasingly in this period that more and more of them are being created to the point where, yeah, they become permanent. And these become towns. And these towns, to accommodate the population, start building new buildings, more lodging for more people moving to towns. And that's where you get the half-timbered house. The house that, instead of just going up, goes up and out to accommodate more apartments for more people. Another name for a half-timbered house is Tudor. His reign has transformed England, and it has made it more prosperous, but his posthumous image is seen as money grubbing and avaricious. So he does have interests other than hoarding money. He is the first one to authorize English exploration of the quote-unquote New World.
Wow, what year was that?
So the patent for John Cabot to go exploring is from the year 1498. To seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, regions, or provinces which before this time have been unknown to all Christians. He also endowed King's College, Oxford, and spent a lot on printing presses, and he built Richmond Palace and the Henry VII Chapel in a pretty new style of architecture, which would come to encompass the period as this early Renaissance type of architecture. There's a historian, and she wrote a book about the private lives of the Tudors, and she did all this research into private expenditures, which thank God she did, so I didn't have to. According to Henry Tudor's movements and his private expenditures, his marriage to Elizabeth was a very, very happy one. He didn't spend a lot of money on himself, as you would expect, but he is constantly buying his wife gifts. He's constantly sending for her to be with him to a degree that isn't usual for royal couples of the time. It would be somewhat standard that they would have separate households, but they are always together. There's no evidence that he ever took a mistress, and he seemed completely devoted. So their 3 children who survived to adulthood all became monarchs as well. Henry VIII, a treaty of perpetual peace, which we will see it was not as perpetual as hoped, married his daughter Margaret to James IV, the same James who had been supporting Perkin Warbeck. So he quickly dropped that cause as soon as he was promised a princess to marry. The idea of the wedding portrait is coming about now, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So portraiture to this point, and we're getting to like the high Renaissance here, but up to this point in history, it's pretty much been religious, as in you are a religious patron, and therefore a portrait of you gets put in this altarpiece that you're commissioning, but never just a portrait of you. So the idea of the wedding portrait, which is a picture of your face sent to your potential husband or wife, is kind of new, and it's kind of bad. They're kind of awful, and we'll see why later. Also, Henry and Elizabeth have one other daughter, Mary Rose, who will get married to the King of France under Henry VIII. So his life is a happy one. He has a happy family life, peaceful kingdom, and he's very rich. But come 1502, that's when heartbreak will shape the rest of his life. So the first terrible thing to happen is that his firstborn son and heir dies of sweating sickness, which is this mysterious illness that was sweeping through England through this time that they're not entirely sure what it was. So he is not a guy who shows a lot of emotion, but he is visibly heartbroken at the death of Arthur when it's announced to him. And he has a spare. He has Prince Harry to be his new heir, but still, what if something should happen to him? So they are still young enough, he and his queen, that they think, we can try again. We can try again for another boy. So Elizabeth gets pregnant and she goes to the Tower of London for her lying in, which it was standard at this time that queen would give birth at the tower. Birth is hard and complicated, and she dies. When he hears about the death of his wife, he locks himself away and won't get out of bed and won't see anyone for days. And people are afraid that it's going to kill him. He never uses the Tower of London as a residence ever again because it's too sad. He casually sends around expressing interest in a new wife, but the emissary that he sends, the instructions that he gives, is that the woman that he wants be pretty much a carbon copy of his first wife. And in the end, he never goes through with it. He also starts to get more paranoid.
Okay.
So he has something established called the Court of Star Chamber, which is just his really own private council. It just meets in his rooms. Nobody knows really how this thing operates. He's not really out and about and seeking company at this point in his life. So he's got this paranoid little court that kind of just buzzes around him. And with it, he is going after those bonds and recognizances with a vengeance and without due process. These things were hated. And especially, there were two counselors on this Court of Star Chamber who were really hated. Sir Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. According to the Chronicle of Polydore Virgil, the informers, as he calls them, when they saw they could easily approach the king, therefore, indiscriminately and dishonorably entrapped and accused men of all sorts and conditions and charged them with a variety of crimes. Also, his relationship with his son is, according to ambassadors to his court, not good. So Prince Harry is pretty much locked away. Henry is terrified something will happen to him. The event that the ambassador witnessed was the king blowing up at his son like he wanted to kill him. He's terrified of not just losing his heir, the Tudor heir, but any heir for England at all. Because at this point, there's no one left. So basically, the last 7 years of his life are kind of spent retreating into an ever closer and more secretive circle, keeping his son sheltered and kind of resenting him, and just filled with worries. When he does die, they took a death mask of him and they made an effigy for his funeral. And what you see is a very careworn man who is in his early 50s, but he looks 70.
So just to sum up this episode, we've talked about Henry Tudor's transformation of England from a country that was at civil war and that was split between these warring factions of roving bands of mercenaries, basically. And I think the most interesting thing about this time really is that you can see how things are transforming from a land where the power is governed by whoever has the army to the people with the money have the power. Or at least you can see that it's heading in that direction.
It's still the same today.
I also like that it's really the end of when we're going to be relying on chronicles to get our information, like the early modern world. Things are factual, scientific, written down, whereas previously, how we know what we know is a little bit legendary, a little bit word of mouth.
Okay.
So, where do you want to go next on the timeline?
I think we should continue unpacking the Tudors, at least for a little bit.
Okay, so you want to go to Henry VIII?
Yeah.
Okay,